What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGO from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and back with another sort of guide to the updates to the newest format that I'm going to be covering on the channel. We've been in Demise format for quite some time, which has been a very fun format based around SJC Anaheim in April of 2007. But now we're diving in to the next format that I'm going to be covering, which is Trooper format, which was held in SJC Indianapolis in August of 2007 of that year. So it uses a new ban list, namely the June 2007 limited list, or ban list. And it introduced some new cards, which are very important. Now, the ban list update doesn't really change much. Most ban lists in the game's history, they banned some new cards, they unbanned some cards, etc. This list only changed two things. It just added two cards to the limited list, one of which was not around. So it didn't really change too much overall. The main things that it did change was that Green Baboon Defender of the Forest. This came out. It's a pretty powerful beast monster. This is now limited, and I'll talk about this when I get into the new cards. And also Magical Stone Excavation Limited, which limits the powers of certain decks like Diamond Dude Turbo, which do rely on this card. Other than that, the list is the same as it was in Demise format. I just have Card Trooper here for an illustrative thing, just to have it on screen at the beginning. But everything else is the same here. And the same applies to the ban list as well and the semi-limited list. So I'm not going to go like super in depth about these lists because you can just check out my Devised format video if you want to see my thoughts on each individual card here. But I think it's a pretty balanced ban list overall. There are some things that I definitely would like to see change, like Confiscation being still at 1 is kind of wild. Dushoot not being anywhere on these lists is also kind of rough. But I think overall it still leads to a pretty fun format. But of course, the changes to Trooper format from Demise format, the things that make it really unique are really in the new card pool. So let's dive into that now. Now, before I dive into the new core set that was released in between Demise format and Trooper format, I want to talk about the miscellaneous cards that were released in kind of random places and just accumulated over time. So there are some notable cards to mention here. They're not all duds, which oftentimes, promo cards and things like that can be a bit bad, but there are some really fun ones here that do make some interesting changes to the format. The first one being Green Baboon Defender of the Forest. Now, this is a card that I mentioned on the limitless section, and it is a very powerful beast monster. Level 7, 2600 attack, 1800 defense. It's a beast itself, and it says, when a face-up beast monster you control is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, while this card is in your hand or graveyard except during the damage step, you can pay 1000 life points and special summon this card. So it's a very easy beast monster to bring out and just get aggressive with, so that makes it very cool. And also, it's very easy to see why this thing was limited to 1, because if you've got 1 engraved, and this thing is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, then you're able to bring out the other one, and you're just able to form like kind of an infinite loop with these green baboons. So it makes sense why this thing is, limited. Now, do I think this thing is going to be format warping? No, I think it can lead to a fun new deck, which is known as Baboon Burn, which I will be diving into in my coverage of Trooper format. But I don't think it will necessarily warp the meta around it, right? It is a very good card, don't get me wrong, but a lot of things that people do side in to face off against it can be very good, like DD Crow really stops this in its tracks. And, even things that stop regular monsters like Bottomless or, Sacred Armor or Mirror Force or whatever, it can stop this as well. So I don't necessarily think that this is going to be the best thing around. I think it will be very good and it will bolster certain beast decks. So I'm excited to get experimenting with this card though. Moving on to some other notable cards that I want to point out. Marshmallow released as well, and this thing is very annoying. Speaking of Baboon Burn, this is just regular Burn, although you can definitely play it in a Baboon Burn deck. This is a level 3 fairy, 300 attack, 500 defense, used by Yugi in the anime, so very iconic. It says, cannot be destroyed by battle after damage calculation. This card was attacked and was face down at the start of the damage step. The attacking player takes 1000 damage. This deals a fair amount of burn damage, and also it sticks around and blocks your opponent from getting in more attacks, which can be very good for you. You can also play in like Monarch decks and stuff like that. Reaper is limited in this format, but if you have multiple Marshmallow on your deck, you can use them to tribute for a Monarch if you so wish. And Monarch does receive a fair boost in this format that could make it a bit more popular than it was in Demise format. But speaking of Marshmallow, they also released a support card for Marshmallow that is very much not good. It's Marshmallow classes, continuous spell. It says, while Marshmallow is in your monster zone, your opponent cannot target other monsters for attacks. And I mean, that's fine, I guess. It basically protects your other monsters, but it's a continuous spell, so that's pretty easy for your opponent to get rid of. And also, there are things like DD Warrior Lady that can still attack into Marshmallow, and then this thing is completely useless. So this thing is basically a -1, not really that good. and I don't recommend playing it, especially given that there are other ways to deal with Marshmallow besides DD Warrior Lady and the like. There's also Shield Crush. This is a card that says target one defense position monster on the field, destroy that target. So you can just use this on the Marshmallow to get rid of it that way. And I could definitely see this thing seeing play, probably not in the main deck for most decks, but in side decks potentially against certain problematic decks, like, burn decks, for instance. This card could definitely see play. Moving on to some more fun promo cards that I think will definitely see some play. We've got Elemental Hero Ocean. This is a level 4 water warrior type monster. 1500 attack, 1200 defense. It says once per turn during your standby phase, you can target one hero monster control or in your graveyard, return that target to the hand. Now this enables a really fun deck from around this time period called Big City or Little City or something like that. It's something related to Hero City. I've heard varying names for it, but it is a very, very fun deck. Basically, the idea is you use Elemental Hero's field spell, the Skyscraper 2, Hero City, to bring back things like Ocean or Stratos or things like that, and then use Ocean to bounce back the Stratos to hand as well. And so you can just get continued pluses off the Stratos, potentially get spell trap pops, things like that. And it just leads to a very, very interesting game plan and a very, very interesting direction for this deck to take. So I'm definitely going to be testing this out in the format as well, because I really like this deck. I think it's really cool, and hopefully I'll be able to do it justice. But this wasn't the only sort of anime support card that came out. We also got Express Roid. This card is a lot less good than Elemental Hero Ocean, but it is pretty neat. It's a level 4 Roid monster, machine, 400 attack, 1600 defense. When this card is summoned, you can target 2 Roid monsters in your graveyard, except for Express Roid, add those targets to your hand, so you get some value off that. Is this very good? No, not really. You can't really take too much advantage off those cards there in this format, but it is still very interesting to see. And I can maybe see people trying to make this work as sort of like an advantage engine, but unfortunately there's other better advantage engines in this format that sort of outclass this thing. But the last of the sort of big anime support cards that I want to mention, although I guess Magician Unite is also an anime support card, is Dark Magic Curtain. This is a normal spell that says pay half your life points, special summon one Dark Magician from your deck. You cannot summon other monsters the turn you activate this card, but you can in normal set. So for all the Dark Magician enthusiasts out there, you now have access to this card, which is very important for the deck. Gets out their boss monster right away, and you can sort of go from there. So kind of neat. The half your life point cost is really a lot, and not being able to summon anything else is also kind of unfortunate, because if your opponent removes the Dark Magician, then you're kind of like, can't do anything else for that turn, basically. But it is still very cool to see this card in this format, and I'm sure that people will cook with this for sure. Next up, I mentioned it right before, but Magicians Unite, there's a normal spell that says if you control 2 or more attack position spellcaster monsters, target one of them, its attack becomes 3,000 until the end of this turn, but also for the rest of this turn after this card resolves, other spellcaster monsters you control cannot attack. So there's some nice things about this. One, your other monsters besides spellcasters can still attack, so you can use this to buff up one of your spellcasters, and then, just attack with your other monsters in addition to it. But I think overall, spellcasters are not really the best in this format, so you're not really the most likely to have 2 in attack mode at a time. Although I guess maybe a Gravekeeper's Spy can get multiple out for you, so maybe it's something you pair with the Spy to get over things, but there are also ways that your opponent can just get around this, like Mirror Force, for instance, is a bit annoying for this deck to deal with. But I think it is still a very interesting card, and maybe people will experiment with it a bit more in the future. Speaking of experimentation, we also have one of the coolest cards out right now, which is Winged Rhinos. I mean, this thing is seeing a lot of hype in Edison format because second place list managed to get second place at Lille in the Edison sort of section of that event. And it makes sense why. I mean, this is a very, very cool strategy. Basically, you use Winged Rhinos to just, keep having a beater on field while you bounce it back to hand by activating things like Needle Sealing, TT, or your draw cards and getting a big chain with like Accumulated Fortune. You can even play gadgets with this as well. So I definitely think this will see play in this format as well. If you look at the deck list in Edison versus the deck list here, there aren't really too many things that you'd really want to change. And so you can definitely play this list in this format as well, and it might even thrive more in this format than in Edison format. But speaking of boosting this up, we've got Legacy of Yatagarasu, which is another chainable draw trap that you can pair with the Winged Rhinos, and it does see play in most Rhinos lists. So also, a big shout out to the YouTuber Zuxid for popularizing the Rhinos list, or I guess originating it, because I guess the second place list is kind of what's popularizing. But either way, shout outs to them for cooking up this list. Maybe they'll cook up something for this format as well. I don't know, but either way, this list should be pretty cool. Next up, we got some other effect monsters that are a bit less good in my opinion. Firstly, we got Phantom Beast Rock Lizard. This pairs with the other Phantom Beast cards that I talked about in Demise format's sort of card guide. There aren't too many of them, and unfortunately, this as a payoff to them is not very good. There's a 2200 attack, 2000 defense point monster with level 7, so you have to do 2 tributes for it normally, but if you're tributing a Phantom Beast monster or a Gazelle, the King of Mythical Beasts, this card can be normal summon with 1 tribute. When this card destroys a monster by battle, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. When this card is destroyed inside of the graveyard by an opponent's card effect, inflict 2000 damage to your opponent. So, it's kind of like a burn card, which is kind of neat. However, the issue with this is if you don't have a Phantom Beast card, which there aren't too many of them, they're not likely to stick around for long, then this thing is hard to bring out. And in addition, Monarch is a very popular deck this format. People could just play a Monarch, beat over this by battle, and then they don't take the 2000 damage there. So I don't think this card's that worth it. I think there are better payoffs for tribute decks in this format. So, I'm probably not going to be taking a look at the Phantom Beast here, but it's still neat to see them get sort of like a pseudo boss monster there. Next up, we've got Dread Scythe Harvester. This is a level 8 wind monster, insect, 2300 attack, 1600 defense. You contribute 1 insect type monster to have this card gain 500 attack until the end of this turn. That's not once per turn. So you can do this multiple times and then bust this up to pretty incredible attack stats in an ideal world. Realistically, though, that's not going to happen, and this thing will generally be a 2 tribute 2300. That is just like much worse than the other 2 tributes you could be going for. Like Demok, for instance, is a 2 tribute monster, and that gets back a spell, which is very, very good. Even like Baboon is probably better as a 2 tribute, even though you normally want to be special summoning this out. It's 2600 attack, which is probably going to be more relevant than a 23 base attack on this thing. So I don't really think this card is that good, but it's still neat to see another insect boss monster in this format. Next, we got Gemini Elves, or Gemini Imps here, not Gemini Elves. But this is a level 4 Fiend with 1000 attack, 1000 defense, and these are actually the monsters, I think, from Delinquent Duo, which is kind of neat. Cool callback there. And also pairs with Duo, or against Duo, that is. This says, during either player's turn, when your opponent activates a spell card, trap card, or monster effect that could make you discard when it resolved, send this card from your hand to the graveyard, negate the activation. If you do, destroy it, then draw 1 card. Now, I don't really think this is the best thing in the world because people aren't playing like card destruction everywhere. People aren't playing like Dark World Dealings everywhere. So realistically, this won't come up against too many things. But, at a side deck tech for those things, if those decks become more popular, maybe it's something to experiment with. But either way, I don't think this will make too much of a splash in this format. Nextly, we get to one of the worst new cards in this format. We've got Return Zombie, the level 4 zombie, 1000 attack, 1600 defense. So during your standby phase, you can pay 500 life points, add this card from your graveyard to your hand. You must have no cards in your hand to activate and to resolve this effect. And that is a big ask in the standby phase, which happens right after the draw phase, aka right after you draw a card. There are certain situations where you won't be doing that. For instance, if you activate Reckless Greed, in a Reckless Greed deck, you won't necessarily be drawing, and maybe you want to add back the Return Zombie for that. Also, if you draw into a Quick Play spell and you want to use the Quick Play spell right away, you can get this thing back. If your opponent's on Drop Off or something like that, then maybe, you won't have cards in hand for this thing to pair with. But I think most of the time, you're not going to be able to pull this effect off, and even if you do pull it off, it's not much to speak of because it's just an 1000 attack, 1600 defense point monster. So even if you're getting it back, you're not really getting back much, right? So I don't really think this card is that good. It's a bit of a funny card, but I don't really think that it's worth playing. Nextly, I just want to point out all the new normal monsters that came out. I don't normally cover these in these, guides because they aren't really that good, but I figured I'd touch on them briefly. You got Fairy Dragon, Cybertech Alligator, some new rituals like Magician of Black Chaos, Zero the Mant, and Javelin Beetle. But realistically, these cards will not really see play because there's other cards that outclass them in pretty much every single way. But I figured it'd be interesting to point out, just in case someone can find a weird edge case for these things, maybe it's good to know about it there. But now that we've covered these sort of miscellaneous promos, let's dive into one of my favorite sets in the game's history, Force of the Breaker, and talk about the new cards it introduces to the format. Now, Force of the Breaker did not do much to change the metagame itself. I'd say that there's really only like one meta-relevant card, and that's Rise of the Storm Monarch. And to be fair to Ryza, it is one of the most insane meta-relevant cards out there. It is a Monarch, so it's level 6, 2400 attack, 1000 defense. It's a winged beast. It says, if this card is tribute summon, target one card on the field, place that target on the top of the deck. That is the best Monarch effect to date because it can target any card on the field. It doesn't destroy, so it doesn't trigger certain weird effects, and also if you tribute summon when your opponent doesn't have a monster, you don't have to like pop itself like Zaborg does. And it's just, so good. This card is really, really meta warping, and it brings the Monarch deck to the next level, and it brings a lot of deck to the next level, honestly. And it will be a major, major feature of what's known as Perfect Circle Monarch, which goes on to define a format later on in Perfect Circle. But it's still very, very good in this format, and honestly, with more testing, it might come to define Trooper as well. but I do still think that this card is a overall net positive inclusion into the metagame, because I think it is a very interesting card, a very fun card to play, and so I look forward to testing it out. The only other card that I'd really put in here as like a potential meta shift is Mako, just because I've seen it in historical lists. I think to get around things like skill drain, I don't really think this card's that good. I think there are other ways to get around skill drain that are a bit better. But I do get why people played this back in the day, especially when different burn decks were playing things like skill drain, wave mode and cannon, etc. Mako makes some sense there. It's a level 4 spellcaster, 79 attack, 600 defense. Says you contribute this card, then target one face-up continuous spell trap on the field, destroy that target. And this is actually interesting because it did see play in the meta, but in the context of Force of the Breaker itself, it makes a lot more sense. And the reason for that is Force of the Breaker focused a lot on continuous spells and continuous traps and taking advantage of them in different ways, which is a very interesting theme to theme a set around. And it doesn't sound like on paper that would be a good theme, but it actually led to some of my favorite archetypes being released and ones that I'll definitely be experimenting with in Trooper format. If we're talking about an archetype using continuous spells, we got to talk about the Crystal Beasts, although they do it in a bit of an interesting way. You see each of the Crystal Beasts, when they're destroyed while they're a monster on the field, they then move to your spell and trap zone and act as a continuous spell there. So it's a very, very interesting mechanic for this time period of the game. Not many decks did this, and it is really, really cool how they take advantage of them overall. The best of these Crystal Beasts is Crystal Beast Sapphire Pegasus, which when it's normal summoned, or to summon it all, I guess, you can place one Crystal Beast monster from your hand, deck, or graveyard face up in your spell trap zone as a continuous spell. And then, of course, if this card's destroyed, it's placed in the continuous spell in the spell trap card zone. So this can allow you to basically, like, not quite tutor out any Crystal Beast from your deck to the spell trap zone, but it kind of does, right? You can't really use them when they're there, but like, you know, there are other cards that you can use to sort of get them in rotation as an actual card as opposed to just a placeholder spell. So I think that it's very, very interesting and very, very powerful for the deck. Next up, we got Topaz Tiger. This is a level 4, 1600 attack, 1000 defense point monster. So if this card attacks an opponent's monster, gains 400 attack during the damage step only. If this face-up card is destroyed in the monster zone, goes to the spell and trap zone as a continuous spell. So they all end with that. I'm going to start like cutting that out when I read these effects, but this can allow you to get a bit more aggressive. Can't get over a Cyber Dragon, but 2000 attack is nothing to scoff at. Next, we got Amber Mammoth. There's a 1700 attack, 1600 defense point monster. Says when another Crystal Beast monster you control is destroyed for an attack, or target for attack, you can change the attack target to this card. So this can protect your weaker Crystal Beasts if you want, or it can just protect Crystal Beasts you want to keep around from a bigger threat. And this card can potentially sort of sacrifice itself in place of those. Next up, we've got Crystal Beast Amethyst Cat. This is a level 3 beast, 1200 attack, 400 defense. So this card can attack your opponent directly, but when it uses this effect, any battle damage inflicted to your opponent is halved. So there's a way to sort of get in for chip damage if you need it. Next up, we've got Crystal Beast Emerald Tortoise, the level 3 Aqua, 600 attack, 2000 defense. It says once per turn, you can target one monster you control that attack this turn, change that target to defense position. So clearly this is meant to be used with Tortoise itself because, you know, if you attack into it, then you can switch into defense mode to just be a wall, and that's kind of nice. But it can apply to your other Crystal Beasts as well, which can come up in certain scenarios. Next up, we've got the worst Crystal Beast, in my opinion. That's Cobalt Eagle. This is a level 4 winged beast. There's one per turn. You can target one Crystal Beast card you control, place that target on top of the deck. So I get the idea behind this card. Basically, the way that you use it is you've got a Crystal Beast in your spell trap zone. You use it to place it back on top of the deck to get it as a monster on the following turn. So that's kind of nice, but effectively you're draw locking yourself, and there's just better Crystal Beasts and better ways to use the Crystal Beasts in the spell card zone than the Cobalt Eagle. Now, that definitely is an interesting card, and I might be trying it out in a Crystal Beast deck in the future. Also, we get to one of the most busted Crystal Beasts if you're able to pull it off, and that is Crystal Beast Ruby Carbuncle. And this is where a lot of the deck's combo potential comes in. Because it's a level 3 fairy, 300 attack, 300 defense. Says when this card is special summoned, you can special summon as many Crystal Beast monster cards as possible from your spell and trap card zones. So, you know, if you've set up a bunch of Crystal Beasts in your spell trap zones, and you bring out a Ruby Carbuncle, and you special summon it, then you can get a major force of Crystal Beast monsters on the field, which can be very, very good. Of course, there are other ways to use your Crystal Beast cards in the spell trap zone, and there are even ways to support Ruby Carbuncle from going from the spell trap zone to the monster zone. The main way there is Crystal Promise, the normal spell. It says target one Crystal Beast card in your spell trap zone, special summon that target. So if you've got a Carbuncle there, you can special summon that. If you've got a Sapphire Pegasus in your spell trap zone, you can special that and then get another Crystal Beast in your spell trap zone. So that's very good there. Next up is Crystal Beastin. This is a normal spell. So special summon one Crystal Beast monster from your deck. You must have 2 or more Crystal Beast cards in your spell trap zone to activate and resolve this effect. So that's very good because if you've already got your Crystal Beast getting set up there, then you can bring out a Ruby Carbuncle and then just special summon those Crystal Beasts immediately. And if there's things like Sapphire Pegasus, then you get more Crystal Beasts in your spell trap zone. So just sort of spirals out of control after a certain point, which is very, very fun to pull off if you're able to pull it off. Next up, we have Crystal Blessing, which isn't a special summoner, but it is still pretty good. It says target up to 2 Crystal Beast monsters in your graveyard. Place their target face up in your spell trap zone. Adds continuous spells. And there are certain ways where your Crystal Beast monsters would go from the spell trap zone to the graveyard, or that they just wind up in the graveyard naturally. So this card can come up in certain scenarios. One of the ways in which they'll wind up in grave is using it for things like Rare Value, which is a normal spell that says if you control 2 or more Crystal Beast cards in your spell trap zones, your opponent chooses 1 Crystal Beast card in your spell trap zone. You send it to the graveyard, and if you do, draw 2 cards. So this is kind of like a Pot of Greed. It's not quite, it does sort of require you to jump through a couple hoops, but it can allow the deck to get a bit more consistency in it if you're able to set up those Crystal Beasts. Although you could argue that if you're already able to set up Crystal Beasts in the spell trap zone, you don't really need the consistency boost because you're already, sort of going off to the races a little bit. Crystal Raigeki is another way to utilize your Crystal Beast in the spell trap zone. The normal trap that says send 1 Crystal Beast card from your spell trap zone to the graveyard, then target 1 card your opponent controls and destroy that target. So that's pretty neat. You get to utilize your Crystal Beast in the spell trap zone to pop your opponent's stuff. But I'd argue that potentially there are other things that you could be doing that are a bit better than this. Honestly, Raigeki Break might be a little bit better as a whole. Yes, this does take advantage of your Crystal Beast, and Raigeki Break requires you to discard a card, which might be a bit worse seeming on paper, but I do think that this is just a little bit more situational, which makes Raigeki Break generally better. Next up, let's get to the big thing that you're using your Crystal Beast in the spell trap zone for, and if you use this, you probably win the game. It is Crystal Abundance, the normal spell card that says send 4 Crystal Beast cards from your spell and trap card zone to the graveyard, send as many cards on the field as possible to the graveyard, then special summon as many Crystal Beast monsters as possible from your graveyard, up to the number of cards sent from your opponent's field to the graveyard by this card effect. So this is how you potentially go for an OTK, because if you've got a full set of 4 Crystal Beasts in your spell trap zone, activate this, wipe the board entirely, bring out a bunch of Crystal Beasts from your graveyard, potentially things like Sapphire Pegasus, like the Carbuncle as well, just to, sort of set up a ton of stuff. I'm pretty sure that you can order this in a way that like the Sapphire Pegasus will trigger before the Carbuncle will trigger, which will allow you to sort of get the Crystal Beast in your spell trap zone to then bring out with Carbuncle and do more stuff with that. I'm pretty sure that can happen, but either way, I mean, you're getting out a ton of monsters on your side of the field, and you're wiping away your opponent's entire board. This is mainly the reason to play Crystal Beast, in my opinion, and we'll definitely be trying to build a deck that sort of aims to fire this thing off as much as possible. But Crystal Beasts aren't alone in sort of their endeavors, which is normal spells and normal traps. They've also got a field spell, which helps them out quite a bit. This is the era where archetypes start receiving more field spell support. It's not as good as field spells will eventually get, but it is still nice to see these archetypes receive something that's specific to them that can help them out a bit here. This is a really, really good field spell, in my opinion. It is one that changes based on the number of Crystal Beasts you have in your spell trap zone. So it's another reason to fill that up with Crystal Beasts. When you have 1 or more in your spell trap zone, this card cannot be destroyed by card effects. When you have 2 or more, once per turn during the opponent's, including the opponent's turn, you can have the battle damage you take. When you have 3 or more, when a spell or trap card is activated, you can send 1 Crystal Beast monster you control to the graveyard and negate the activation if you do destroy it. I mean, that is very, very good. And that is not a once per turn. Fun fact. When you got 4 or more, once per turn during your main phase, you can draw 1 card, which is also extremely good, just continued value. And then once you have 5, once per turn during your main phase, you can target 1 Crystal Beast card in your spell trap zone and special summon that target. So if you've got a Carbuncle in your spell trap zone, you can bring that out and then special summon out all your Crystal Beasts there. You might not want to do that because you might want to continue to get the value off Rainbow Ruins. But if you've got some Sapphire Pegasus in there as well, you can sort of fill up your spell and trap card zone with more things and then still get some value off of Rainbow Ruins. So Rainbow Ruins does a lot for the deck. It's very, very good. Obviously you need a couple to really get beneficial effects in there. Like you'd prefer to have 3 or more when you have this thing on field. But overall, it's still a very, very good field spell there, and there are ways to cheat it out, namely Last Resort. Last Resort is a normal trap that says activate only when your opponent's monster declares an attack. You can select 1 Ancient City Rainbow Ruins from your deck and activate it. If your opponent had an active field spell card when this card was activated, they can draw 1 card. Because at this point in the game, we play by the rules where if you activate a field spell and your opponent had an active field spell, then that active field spell will be destroyed and make way for the new one. So that's just how the game was played at this time period. And so that's why this has that effect there, to sort of replace the thing that they lost. Of course, if you play with modern rules, this card becomes a lot more good for your opponent because they will not lose their field spell. But in Trooper format, that is how that will work. Now, interestingly enough, this is not the only sort of way to fetch new field spells out from the deck in this format. Of course, we already have Terraforming around, and I think Terraforming is probably better than this card on the whole. But we also have now some more archetype-specific cards to search out field spells. Firstly, we've got Elemental Hero Captain Gold. This is a level 4 warrior, 2100 attack, 800 defense, so you can discard this card to the graveyard, add 1 Skyscraper from your deck to your hand. If Skyscraper is not face up on the field, destroy this card. So this is a way to get Skyscraper immediately out of the deck for hero decks, and while Skyscraper isn't quite as good as Skyscraper 2, it is still a card that maybe they want to play. And so this is definitely a card that you can sort of add to your hero decks if you want to turbo into Skyscraper more. Nextly, we've got Graveyard's Commandant, which is probably the best of these at the time. This is a level 4 spellcaster, 1600 attack, 1500 defense. You can discard this card to the graveyard, add 1 Necro Valley from your deck to your hand. So if you want to play a Gravekeeper strat, potentially shut down more graveyard focused strategies, you can play this. And this is generally better than Terraforming, because while Terraforming can be dead if you draw it later on when you already have Necro Valley, this thing is not dead. You summon it out under Necro Valley, it's a 2100 beater, and that is pretty good for you. Next up, we've got Harpy Queen. Harpy Queen can search out Harpy's Hunting Ground. Now, another nice thing about Harpy Queen is that this card's name becomes Harpy Lady while on field or in the graveyard. Now, that is notably different from some of the past Harpy Lady support cards, which are monsters that are always treated as Harpy Lady, whether on field, in graveyard, or in deck. And that is very important because it means that if you're building a Harpy deck, you can only play 3 total of them. You know, you can't quite play 9 copies of Harpy Ladies 1, 2, and 3. You have to play 3 total. But this sort of solves that problem a little bit. And it also is pretty nice because Harpy's Hunting Ground is a good card for the deck. It allows you to pop more of your opponent's stuff. And this card might be a reason to revisit Harpies. I think I probably will revisit Harpies in this format because they've also got Icarus Attack, which is a very, very powerful card for Winged Beasts. Ryza is also a Winged Beast, so you can pair that with Icarus Attack as well. So I think Harpy Lady might be a little bit better in this format. I don't think they'll necessarily be tier 1, but it will be something to experiment with and have fun with. Moving on to some of the recruiters that I don't really think will see much play in this format. We've got Zoradius, Herald of Heaven. Level 4, 2100 attack, 800 defense point monster, just like Captain Gold, where you can discard this card to the graveyard, add 1 Sanctuary in Sky from your deck to your hand, and then if the Sanctuary in Sky is not on the field, destroy this card. So very similar to Captain Gold in terms of the effect. But, you know, Sanctuary in the Sky decks, like, you can play that sort of thing. Counter Fairies did receive some support in the last set, Strike of Neos. That does pair well with Sanctuary in the Sky. But I think overall, it's not quite worth it playing this deck, so I don't think this card will see much play. Next up, we got Warrior of Atlantis. This is actually a card that should not work, but it does work. This says you can discard this card to the graveyard, add 1 a Legendary Ocean from your deck to your hand. And the reason why this shouldn't work is that a Legendary Ocean is always treated as Umi. So technically, there's no card that exists as a Legendary Ocean in the game. But, you know, there's a ruling issue that basically it does work as it's intended to be. So you search out a card that is written as a Legendary Ocean, even if it's treated as Umi, from your deck to your hand. Next up, we've got Archfiend General here, level 4, Fiend, 2100 attack, 800 defense. It says you can discard this card to the graveyard, add 1 Pandemonium from your deck to your hand, and then if Pandemonium is not on field, destroy this card. So very similar to Zoradius and Elemental Hero Captain Gold. Lastly, we've got Destroyer Service. This is a level 4 dinosaur, 1800 attack, 1100 defense. So you can discard this card to the graveyard, add 1 Jurassic World from your deck to your hand. And no one's really playing Jurassic World. Dinosaurs are not really that good, but it is so cool to see this card there for that deck. And as a fun note, they sort of synced up the stats here, so that way, under all these field spells, they'll all have 2100 attack. Necro Valley gives 500 to Gravekeepers. Harpy's Hunting Ground gives 200 to Harpies, or just Winged Beasts in general. Legendary Ocean gives 200 to things like Warrior of Atlantis, and Jurassic World gives 300 to Dinosaurs. So all these things will have 2100 defense total. And I just think that's like a nice little touch there. Now, if we're talking about field spells, there were some also generic field spell support cards as well, like Field Barrier. Field Barrier is a continuous spell that says field spells on the field cannot be destroyed. Neither player can activate a new field spell card. You can only control 1 Field Barrier. So it is a continuous spell. So continuing with the continuous spell theme. And it does help out decks that are more reliant on their field spells because, you know, if you back up like a Necro Valley with a Field Barrier, your opponent needs more than an MST to deal with that. Now, Heavy Storm is still around, so they could use Heavy Storm, but I do think it's nice to just have that sort of built-in protection there, even if it's not really that good. But there was another new field spell that came out in the set, even though it doesn't have a recruiter, and that is Otherworld, the A-Zone. This is some more alien support, which is kind of funnily like one of the most supported archetypes in the GX era. Like every set seems to have an alien card coming out, even if it's not that good. And this is no exception. Field spell that says if your opponent's monster battles with an alien monster you control, the opponent's monster loses 300 attack and defense during the damage calculation only. Not really that good. That's the effect of like an A counter if that effect is online. So that's kind of the reason why they have that. But is that going to be worth playing this card? Probably not in Alien deck, as Alien decks focus on other things like placing A counters, which a new piece of support does actually help out quite a bit with, which is A Cell Breeding Device, the continuous spell that says during each of your standby phases, put one A counter on one face-up monster your opponent controls. So if you're able to drag the game out long enough, this thing can have a lot of value for you. You know, you've got a lot of monsters in the Alien archetype that do get benefits based on whether your opponent has A counters or not, and so this helps out quite a bit with that. Next up, we got Mass Hypnosis, the continuous trap. It says activate only while you control an alien monster. Select and take control of up to 3 of your opponent's monsters that each have an A counter on them. This card is destroyed during the end phase of the turn it is activated. So in general, you want to use this thing on your turn to take control of your opponent's stuff and then attack in for a ton of damage, potentially tribute those things off. But you could potentially use this on your opponent's turn to wall up against an attack that they're mounting. It's just not really that good in that case because it does destroy itself at the end phase. Moving on to some more relevant continuous spells, because funnily enough, there is another archetype that's largely based around continuous spells, even though these continuous spells are actually continuous spells and not just monsters like the Crystal Beast. We've got Blaze Accelerator. This is a continuous spell card that says you can target one monster your opponent controls, send one pyro monster with 500 attack or less from your hand to the graveyard, and if you do destroy that target, your monsters cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. So you might be wondering how you use this thing and what archetype this actually goes to. This is part of the Volcanic archetype, another GX anime archetype, just like Crystal Beasts, that have some neat sort of things that you can do with them to sort of garner advantage over time. The firstly is Volcanic Shell. This is a level 1 Pyro, 100 attack, 0 defense. You can pitch it for Blaze Accelerator. This is 1 per turn. You can pay 500 life points, add 1 Volcanic Shell from your deck to your hand. This card must be in the graveyard to activate and resolve this effect. Now, add a note, this is a soft once per turn, so if you've got multiple shells in the graveyard, you can activate each of them once. Now, you only have 3 shells that you can actually play, so you're not the most likely to do that, but it can come up in certain scenarios, and you can just get more value off this over time, you know? Just searching out another shell for the next turn with your Blaze Accelerator, so that's pretty good. And this thing is also not once per turn. You can use this effect multiple times to send multiple pyros from your hand to the graveyard and pop those things. You just won't be able to attack that turn. So the shells can really come up and just blow up your opponent's board in a very, very nice manner. Now, if you want to blow up your opponent's board in a different way, we also have Volcanic Scattershot. This says if this card is sent to the graveyard, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. If this card is sent to the graveyard by the effect of a Blaze Accelerator card, you can send 2 Volcanic Scattershots from your hand or deck to the graveyard and destroy all monsters your opponent controls. So you can pitch this to Blaze Accelerator because it's got 500 attack, and then blow up their whole board. So that's very nice. And also inflicts 500 damage to your opponent for each one. So you can deal 1,500 damage on top of that, which is very, very nice to see. So this is obviously the thing that you really want to be pitching off Blaze Accelerator. If if your opponent has a full board and you want to clear it, Scattershot makes more sense. But the advantage that you get off shell is very nice. So if your opponent has a bit of a smaller board, going for the shell could be the way to go. Of course, you might have noticed that these have said Blaze Accelerator cards and not just Blaze Accelerator. And that's because there's another Blaze Accelerator card. Try Blaze Accelerator. There's a continuous spell that says activate this card by sending 1 face-up Blaze Accelerator you control to the graveyard. During your main phase, you can target 1 monster your opponent controls, send 1 pyro monster from your hand to the graveyard. No attack restriction there. And if you do, destroy that target. And if you do that, inflict 500 damage to your opponent. Your monsters cannot attack the turn that you activate this effect. So this is on paper potentially better than the regular Blaze Accelerator because you send any pyro, not just a monster like Scattershot or Shell. But in practice, because you have Scattershot and Shell, you never really need to go into Tri-Blaze unless you want to pull off a certain boss monster that I'll get to momentarily. But Blaze Accelerator is generally the thing that you're going for here, and it can be very, very strong. Another thing that makes it pretty strong is Wildfire. This is a quick play spell that says pay 500 life points, destroy all Blaze Accelerator cards you control, and if you do, destroy as many monsters on field as possible. Then special summon 1 Wildfire token, Pyro, Fire, level 3 attack, 1000, defense 1000, in attack position. Your monsters cannot attack the turn you activate this card, but because it's a quick play spell, you can use this during your opponent's turn as basically, a dark hole on your opponent's turn, which is kind of nuts, right? It can be a bit telegraphed because if you've got a Blaze Accelerator up and your opponent knows about Wildfire, they can be like, well, okay, that might be a Wildfire there. But it also turns any set monster, not set monster, but every set card with the Blaze Accelerator into a potential Wildfire. And your opponent has to play around that lest they get blown out entirely, right? So this is a very, very neat sort of combo that you can do. It's very, very powerful when it does go off. Now, you might be wondering about the consistency of this deck because, continuous spells are not necessarily the easiest things to get to your hand, but luckily the archetype has a way to get to them in the form of Volcanic Rocket. This is a level 4, 1900 attack, 1400 defense monster. Pyro says when this card is summoned, you can add 1 Blaze Accelerator card from your deck or graveyard to your hand. So this means that you only really have to play 1 Blaze Accelerator. If it's destroyed, you can always get it back with Rocket. And Rocket is just a very good card. It's 1900 attack, so that is a good beater. And yeah, it just gets you value upon being summoned, just like Stratos does. So Volcanic Rocket, Very, very good card overall. And definitely one of the reasons to play this deck. Of course, there are other Volcanic cards in the deck that you can play if you want to. Volcanic Blaster is a level 3 Pyro, 1200 attack, 600 defense. Says when this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can place one Volcanic monster from your deck on top of your deck. So this basically means that if you don't have your Blade Accelerator combos online, you can add a Rocket to the top of your deck, draw that, activate it, get a search of the Blade Accelerator. If you don't have fodder for your Blade Accelerator, you've got Shell or Scattershot that you can add to the top of your deck with Blaster. So that's kind of nice there. So overall, fine card. I don't necessarily think it's the best thing in the world because it is a bit slow and it does draw clock you for a turn. But like, I think it's fine if you do want to play it. If you want to go all in for the Volcanic stuff, this is probably something that you'd want to play because it is better than most of the other monsters in the archetype here. Volcanic Recharge is also a neat card. It's a normal trap. It says return up to 3 Volcanic monsters from your graveyard to your deck. So this can mean either sending back some scatter shots. It can also mean potentially sending back your shells to recycle those. So it is a pretty neat card overall for the strategy. Although you have to wonder, is it really necessary and does it do enough to justify a place in the deck? Moving on to the bigger monsters here, because this deck does have bigger monsters. We got Volcanic Slicer, level 4, 1800 attack, Pyro. So once per turn, you can inflict 500 damage to your opponent. If you activate this effect, this card cannot attack this turn. But if you've used Blaze Accelerator or tried Blaze Accelerator's effect, you won't be attacking that turn anyway. So it adds a nice little bit of burn damage to your deck. Next up, we got Volcanic Hammer, and this has a similar sort of thing. It's a 2400 attack point monster, level 5. It says once per turn, during your main phase, you can inflict damage to your opponent equal to the number of Volcanic monsters in your graveyard times 200. This card cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. So in general, this will likely be larger than the damage that you're dealing off Slicer. But also, this does require a tribute, so it might not be as good. So I wouldn't necessarily play either of these cards, but if I did play one, I'd play Slicer over the Hammer, even though Hammer does have more attack and deal slightly more damage. Lastly, we've got the boss monster of the archetype. We've got Volcanic Doomfire. This is a level 8, 3000 attack, 1800 defense point monster that cannot be normal summoner set. Must first be special summoned from your hand by sending one Tri-Blaze Accelerator you control to the graveyard. So this is sort of the way to get out the big boss monster is use Volcanic Rocket to search either Blaze or Tri-Blaze, and then you get out of Tri-Blaze, and then you get out Doomfire, and then you're in a pretty decent spot, but Doomfire doesn't really do enough to get you there, as we'll see. Its effect reads, during your opponent's battle phase, all attack position monsters your opponent controls that can attack must attack this card. If this card destroys a monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, destroy as many monsters your opponent controls as possible, and if you do, inflict 500 damage to your opponent for each monster destroyed by this effect. So this seems nice on paper because you're not doing the attacking with your Blade Accelerator and Tri-Blade Accelerator, so you're just using Doomfire to do the attacking for you, basically. Like on your opponent's turn, they have to attack into it multiple times, and then you get off its effects, and you're in a pretty good spot, right? Well, the issue with this is that your opponent does not have to go to battle phase, right? Just during your opponent's battle phase, it does not force your opponent into the battle phase. And so, that's not a guaranteed thing. If you've got a Doomfire up on field and your opponent doesn't want to attack into it, they just are not going to go to battle phase or switch all their monsters to defense mode or something like that, So this card doesn't really do as much as it seems to promise on the tin, although it is a very, very cool card overall. I like the design of it. It looks very neat, but realistically, I think that this deck is largely just better focused on more advantage getting with Rocket into Accelerator and getting Shell off and Scattershot off. It's got a really neat engine there, but I think the sort of added trimmings of the archetype are not really worth playing. Of course, there are two more added trimmings that are meant for this archetype, even though they apply to Pyros in general. We got Soul of Fire first, the normal spell that says your opponent draws one card. Select one Pyro monster from your deck and remove it from play. Inflict damage to your opponent equal to half the attack of the removed monster. If you activate this card, you cannot declare an attack this turn. So this pairs well with Blade Accelerator and Tri-Blade Accelerator. And if you are playing Doomfire in your deck, this is a good use for it. You banish it, get 1500 damage off from your opponent, and that's pretty good. Next up, we got Firewall. Firewall is a continuous trap that says when your opponent declares a direct attack, you can banish one Pyro monster in your graveyard, negate the attack once per turn during your standby. Pay 500 life points or destroy this card. So this is a way to protect yourself while you're not attacking. But I think overall, it's not really worth it. 500 a turn it can add up. And also you've got more cost to pay like for Shell. So I don't really like this card overall. But it is a neat way to sort of stall out your opponent a bit. So I can potentially come up and be good. Lastly, for the continuous traps, I want to mention two sort of generic continuous traps that you can play in this set, namely Hard Shell and Zombie and Hard Shell and Goblin. So Hard Shell and Zombie is a continuous trap that says each time a monster you control inflicts battle damage to your opponent, select one card from your opponent's graveyard and return to the bottom of your deck. So this can be kind of nice to sort of reset like your opponent's shells if they've got that in graveyard and they don't have another shell in hand, which realistically they will never have, but could potentially come up. You can sort of reset their progress on that. But I don't really think this card is that good overall, even though, there are some weird edge cases where it could come up. Hard Stone Goblin is a similar sort of situation. So each time a monster you control inflicts battle damage to your opponent, return one card in your opponent's spell trap zone to its owner's hand. So realistically, that's not really going to come up that often. The one deck where I could see it potentially coming up is like Ancient Gear. If you've got monsters that are not Ancient Gears and you attack in with like an Ancient Gear soldier, deal damage to your opponent, and then you bounce back their traps that they could have potentially activated there. But like realistically, that's a very large edge case, and like I don't really think it's that good for that, because most things your opponent can just reactivate on their following turn or reset them the following turn. So it just isn't really that good here. But there are some cards that do sort of pair with all these continuous spells and traps, no matter what strategy you are going with for them. So I wanted to cover these two before we actually get into those, because they are pretty interesting, even if they're not cards that I would necessarily play. The first is Dwell in the Depth. There's a level 3 Earth Dragon, 1500 attack, 700 defense. It says gains 300 attack for each continuous spell in your spell trap zone. So if you're playing Crystal Beast, this thing can actually get up to a whopping 3k attack if you've got your full spell trap zone set up there. But realistically, you probably won't have too many of these. All you really need, though, is 2, and there's a 2100 normal summon, so that might be good enough to play in the Crystal Beast deck if you want it. But I think overall, most decks will not be playing this card. Next up is Gem Flash Energy. There's a continuous trap that says during each of your standby phases, inflict damage to your opponent equal to the number of face-up continuous spell cards on the field times 300. This is very good anti-Crystal Beast tech, but I'm not sure you necessarily want to play it in your Crystal Beast deck of your own, because then you would never really get to the full 4 Crystal Beasts that you need for Crystal Abundance, because this will be taken up as spell trap zone as well. So I don't really think this is that good. But as anti-Crystal Beast tech, it could be decent. And if you're playing a Volcanic Engine, where you're playing the Scatter Shots and the Blaze Accelerators and stuff, you could potentially set that up and do stuff with that. But I think overall, this card doesn't really burn enough to make it worth it in most decks. Next up, we got Seismic Crasher, the level 3 rock monster, 1400 attack, 700 defense. So twice per turn, you send one continuous spell or continuous trap card you control to the graveyard to inflict 500 damage to your opponent. So this can be used to deal a bit more burn damage than something like Gem Flash Energy, although you could potentially use it to send Gem Flash Energy, that's face up already, to graveyard to deal a bit more burn damage. So maybe you want to play this in those style of decks, but I don't really think these cards deal enough burn damage to make them worth playing. Next up, we got 2 tribute monsters, Magnus Slash Dragon and Grava Crush Dragon. Both are very similar. They've got the same stats, 2400 attack, 1200 defense, but one is light and one is dark. The Magnus Slash Dragon allows you to send one face-up continuous spell card you control to the graveyard to destroy one spell or trap card your opponent controls. And the Grava Crush Dragon says you can send one face-up continuous spell card you control to the graveyard, then target one monster your opponent controls and destroy that target. So one destroys spells and traps, the other destroys monsters. So that's kind of a neat thing if you've got that set up. But most of the time, a tribute monster for that sort of effect is not really worth playing. So it can be neat in certain decks that maybe can try and take advantage of these, but overall, I don't really think it's worth experimenting with these. But because there's so much support for continuous spells and traps, there also has to be sort of anti-support against it. So just ways to sort of tech out your deck in a way that's prepared for decks that sort of fill up their back row with continuous spells and traps and, get through that. The main way being Tornado. There's a quick play spell that says activate only when there are 3 or more cards in your opponent's spell trap zones. Destroy 1 card in your opponent's spell and trap zone. So this is basically a worse MST when they have a ton of cards in their back row. And as a note, this is only really better than something like Twister when they've got a bunch of cards set in their back row. So I guess it doesn't really pair with the continuous spells theme that's been going on here. Twister really should have been in this set, and then Tornado should have been in the last set. That would make more sense to me. But it is still a card that you can play if you want to really go in on the back row hate, especially if your opponent does play a deck that plays a ton of back row. It's basically just MST in that case. But the better way to deal with your opponent's back row is probably something like Eradicator Epidemic Virus, which is out in this format. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't place this at the beginning of this section where I talked about Ryza and other meta cards. And the reason for that is there aren't really many ways to get this thing off. There aren't many ways to get a monster with 2500 or more attack as a dark monster. While there are decks that can get out monsters with over 2000 attack for DDV, 2500 is another threshold entirely, so it can make it a bit tricky to pull off. Now, this set does have ways to sort of try and get monsters above this threshold. But before I talk about that, let's talk about what the card actually does, because if you do tribute the dark monster with 2500 or more attack, you get to declare one type of card, spell or trap. And then you get to look at your opponent's hand, all spell traps they control, and all cards they draw until the end of their 3rd turn after this card resolves, and destroy all cards of that declared type. So this can be very good against decks that are all in on one type or another, and it can just be good in general for getting rid of powerful spells, powerful traps, and anything else you're worried about there. So This card can be very good against certain decks, but again, that threshold is hard to reach, but that is why Force of the Breaker is here to help with things like Sword of Dark Rites. There's an equip spell that says, equip only to a dark monster, gains 400 attack, and then when the equipped monster is tributed and this card is sent to the graveyard, return this card to your hand. So if you use Sword of Dark Rites to get a monster above the 2,500 life point threshold that it needs, for Eradicator Epidemic Virus, then you tribute for Eradicator Epidemic Virus, then you get to get back Sword of Dark Rites, potentially equip another monster and get it above the Deck Devastation Virus threshold, things like that. So this is kind of neat in that way, although I don't really think it's that good overall. Next up, we got Lich Lord, King of the Underworld. This is a 2,400 attack point monster, so not quite at the 2,500 life point threshold, but if you do put on Sword of Dark Rites, then does get up above that point. And it says, if you tribute this card, the tribute must be dark. And then if this card is tributed by a card effect and sent to the graveyard, add this card from your graveyard to your hand. So the idea is that potentially you tribute a monster equipped with Sword of Dark Rite that served its purpose, get back to Sword of Dark Rite, summon a Lich Lord, equip it with Sword of Dark Rite, activate Epidemic Amplifiers, and then you get to get this thing back into your hand, get the sword back into your hand, and you basically lost no cards. You just lost a lot of tempo. I don't really think this is that good, but it is kind of interesting to see them sort of provide a way to pull off Eradicator and just the deck devastation viruses. I'm not sure why they're going all in on this, although it might be related to a monster that I'll talk about pretty soon. But I'm just sort of viewing this in the lens of Eradicator Epidemic Virus, because I think that's the main way that these will see play if they do see play. Next up is Mr. Archfiend, the level 5 Dark Fiend, 2400 attack, 0 defense, says you can normal summon this card without tributing when once per turn during the end phase. If this card was summoned this way, destroy this card, and if you do, take 1000 damage. So you can actually use this with Eradicator if you equip it with a Sword of Dark Rite, and it's a free summon from your hand, so that's pretty good. It could just see play in other decks as well, like skill drain decks. You can bring this out. It's 2400 beater, and that's pretty good for you if it won't be destroyed by its effect in the end phase due to skill drain. So there are some ways that you can utilize this outside of that, but I'm just sort of viewing this in the realm of the virus here. But if you want to bring back your Mr. Archfiends after using it for Recurring Nightmare or just having it be popped with its own effect, you do have Recurring Nightmare here. It says target 2 dark monsters with 0 defense in your graveyard, add those targets to your hand. So that could be things like Mr. Archfiend. It could be even things like Relinquish, going way back in time through the card pool. There are a variety of cards that this can work with, and so it's interesting to try and see if any decks that play those sort of cards can utilize this well. Next up, we've got Prometheus, King of the Shadows, the level 4 Fiend, Dark, 1200 attack, 800 defense. If this card normal summon, banish 1 or more dark monsters from your graveyard, and if you do, this card gains 400 attack for each until the end of this turn. So if you summon this out and you banish 4 dark monsters from your graveyard, it will be fueled up to a point where Eradicator can tribute it, but if you just do 2, that's Deck Devastation Virus territory. That's also pretty decent. Next up, we got Plague Wolf, which is really bad. It's just here because it's a dark monster that I figured I'd talk about with all the other dark monsters in this section. It's a zombie that says once per turn, you can make this card's original attack, or this card's attack, become double its original attack until the end of this turn. Once per turn during the end phase, if this effect was activated, destroy this card. So buffs it up to 2000. I mean, that's not really that good in the face of like Cyber Dragons and stuff. It doesn't even pair with Sword of Dark Rite to get over 2400 because it's just 2400. It doesn't reach the 2500 life point threshold. So I also think that maybe there's a chance that like this card won't actually gain more attack after it uses this effect because it says double its original attack. And sometimes phrasing on cards like that are weird where they won't then allow for additional attack buffs afterwards. But I'm not really going to get into that because this card is not worth playing. This card's really bad in general. So I don't think this card should see play, but it is kind of an interesting card to talk about here. Now to get to the boss monster that I alluded to earlier, I think these Dark Tribute stuff are also here because of Diabolos, King of the Abyss. This is a very, very cool boss monster, level 8, Dark Dragon, 2800 attack, 1000 defense, cannot be spell summoned. You have to hard tribute summon this. And then if you tribute summon this card, the tributes must be dark. It cannot be tributed by card effects while face up on the field. And then once per turn during your opponent's draw phase, before their normal draw, look at the top card of the opponent's deck. And if you do, place that card either on the top of the deck or the bottom of the deck. So this could potentially see play outside of just tribute summon focused decks. It could be see play in like Mausoleum of the Emperor style decks, because while it does say if you tribute summon this card, the tributes must be dark, it doesn't say anything about just normal summoning it without tribute due to Mausoleum. So that's a way to potentially get this thing out. And once it's on field, you can sort of control what your opponent is drawing, kind of like a Perfect Circle Monarch deck can, by looking at the top of their deck, either putting it on bottom or the top. If it's bad, you put it on top. If it's good, you put it on bottom. And while your opponent could potentially draw a second good card on top of that, it's still a pretty neat effect there. So I like this card a lot. I think it's very cool. And they built it in so that way you could not use it with Eradicator Epidemic Virus. So probably a good thing overall. But still, I think it'll be interesting to see if people make this deck into the boss monster for any decks that they've got. Now, speaking of dark boss monsters, there actually are some others in this set, mainly one other, in the form of Sky Scourge Norlerus. This is a level 8 Dark Monster Fiend, 24 attack, 1500 defense, and it's sort of a retrain of Chaos Emerald Dragon. So it said this card cannot be normal summoned or set. This card cannot be special summoned except by removing from play 1 Light Fairy type monster from your graveyard and 3 Dark Fiend type monsters in your graveyard. And pay 1,000 life points to send all cards on the field in both players' hands to the graveyard. Then you draw 1 card. So it's kind of like Chaos Emerald Dragon, although it's a lot worse because it requires much more strict summoning requirements here. So, is this card worth playing? I don't really think so at this point in time. There will be decks in the future that can take advantage of this card, but right now, I don't really think it does much here. That can't really be said for something like Sky Scourge On Rise, which does potentially have some applications here. I would say that this card has applications later on more, but it can potentially see play in this format if people want it enough, because there's no Chaos Sorcerer in this format, and this thing is kind of like Chaos Sorcerer. It is a 2400 attack, 1500 defense point light fairy monster. Says this card cannot be normal summoned or set. This card cannot be special summoned except by removing from play 3 light fairy type monsters and 1 dark fiend type monster in your graveyard. Once per turn, you can remove from play 1 face-up monster on the field. If you activate this effect, this card cannot attack during this turn. So it's very similar to Chaos Sorcerer. I think they meant it to be sort of an homage to Chaos Sorcerer or for BLS if you really want to. But this thing is pretty good. And if you're playing like a counter fairy deck, potentially, like you're playing recruiters, maybe like Nova Summoners or Shining Angels, you get the fairies engraved that way. If you're playing Sangan, that's Dark Fiend. And then there you go. You've got your material for this to bring this thing out. So this thing can be pretty good if it hits the field. I'm not really sure if it's as good in this format as it will be in later formats, but it's still cool to see if anyone can actually experiment with this and potentially break it. Next up, we've got Sky Scourge Imbecile. This is a level 6 Earth Fairy, 2200 attack, 1600 defense. So this card cannot be special summoned. If you tribute summon this card by triggering one of the following monsters, this card gains the appropriate effect. A Light Fairy monster, negate the effects of all spell cards, and then a Dark Fiend monster, negate the effects of all trap cards. So that's kind of a neat effect. It's kind of either Imperial Order or Royal Decree, depending on which one you tribute. But I think overall this thing is probably not worth it because 2200 attack just doesn't cut it in this format. Monarchs are much bigger, and Monarch decks don't necessarily need to use spell and traps to get over this thing. So maybe there's a side deck card against certain strategies, but I think overall this card is not really worth playing. Speaking of new strategies that are not worth playing in this set, we've got Go-Go the Gallant Ninja. This isn't even really a strategy. It's just sort of a loose theming of cards that I do think is kind of interesting. So let's talk about it. It's a Wind Warrior, 1500 attack, 1000 defense. It says when this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent must discard 2 random cards. Your opponent must have at least 5 cards in their hand for you to activate and to resolve this effect. So, if your opponent has 5 cards in hand, you get to discard 2 random ones. That's kind of neat. But at the same time, they're likely not going to have 5 cards in hand. If they got 5 cards in hand, then you're already in kind of an awkward spot. And Go-Go is basically a 1500 vanilla outside of that. So I don't really think this card's that good. But for some reason, they decided to build some lore into it with some other cards here, namely Introduction to Gallantry. This is a normal trap, so it activate only when your opponent has 5 or more cards in their hand. Your opponent discards 1 random card. Again, just like with Go-Go, you're not really going to be able to activate it turn 1. And by the time you reach turn 2, maybe you activate this card so it's slightly better than Go-Go because you don't have to wait for your next turn for a battle phase. But you do have to sort of activate this right away, and this is much worse than like something like Dust Shoot, which is illegal at 3 copies in this format. So I don't think this card is worth playing. The last card here is Secret to the Gallant, which is a bit more flexible than the other ones. It says select 1 normal monster you control. When the selected monster inflicts battle damage to your opponent this turn, your opponent discards 2 random cards. Now, this card still isn't really that good. It asks a lot for you. But I do think that it does pair with the sort of normal monster theme that came up in Strike of Neos. So it's kind of cool to see them return to that well, while also building onto that with something like Go-Go the Gallant Ninja. I think the implication here that Go-Go was a normal monster that learned the secret of the Gallant and was able to sort of do this thing. But I think overall, this is not a good strategy. But still, returning to Strike of Neos is kind of cool. And there's some other cards that might also return there. But before we get to those, I want to talk about Terrible Deal, because it's also a hand rip card. And because I'm talking about the hand rip cards here, I figured I'd mention this as well. This is sort of a revamp of Dark Deal, which is actually, I'm not going to say good card, but like potentially decent card on paper for Dark Worlds. But this is much worse. This is actually only by paying 1,000 life points when your opponent activates a spell card, your opponent discards 1 random card. And I feel like this is honestly here just because like they knew that confiscation time was coming. Like you see Skull Servant patting confiscation on the head as if like they know that the time is almost up for this card because that card is absurd. But this card is much worse because, whereas Dark Deal does sort of swap out the effect of the normal spell that they're activating for the discard effect, this card just says discard 1 card. So it's basically pay 1,000 life points in the specific situation to discard a card from your opponent's hand, which is not quite that good. So I don't really think this card is worth playing. But going back to sort of the idea that they're returning to Strike of Neos stuff, we also had a return to the 6 Samurai archetype, which was introduced in Strike of Neos and is one of my favorite archetypes in the game's history. So let's see what they got. Let's see if any of this is worth playing in the 6 Sam deck. Max the Wall is a normal trap that says pay life points so that you only have 100 left. Special summon as many 6 Samurai monsters with different names from the graveyard as possible. You're not supposed to summon a monster with the same name as a monster you already control. So this can be potentially good. It gets out a lot of 6 Sams, and 6 Sams is a bit of an aggro deck. That means that you want to just get attacking in there. But I do think that this card is kind of redundant. I feel like Return to the 6 Samurai is generally all you'll really ever need. You don't really need Backs to the Wall that often, and 100 life points is a really risky spot to get to. So I don't really think this card's worth playing here. But maybe, there will be some future formats where it actually does, something good. Next up, we got Breakthrough. This is a normal trap that says select 1 6 Samurai monster you control. If the selected monster destroys an opponent's monster by battle, Great Shogun Chien and all 6 Samurai monsters you control can attack your opponent directly during the battle phase of this turn. So this is a way to sort of get even more aggressive here. But again, I feel like 6 Sams don't have a problem like eating through your opponent's defenses if they've got enough 6 Sams out on field. So I don't really think this is worth it, because generally, if you hit over one, if they've got another, you probably have another 6 Sam that can deal with that other, and then you can get in for damage, and you're in a perfectly fine spot for later. So I don't really like this card, even though it does, on paper, allow the deck to get more aggressive. Down to the last 3 cards, but I didn't really have a spot to put them, so I just put them at the end. Firstly, we've got Lucky Iron Axe, the equip spell that says the equipped monster gains 500 attack. If this face-up card you control is destroyed by your opponent's card effect, send to your graveyard, draw 1 card. So this tries to solve one of the big issues with equips in that, if they're destroyed, it's kind of rough for you. So this one, if it's destroyed, you get to draw a card, but it's specifically only destroyed by your opponent's card effect. So if they're still able to get over the monster you equip to it, then you don't get that effect, which is kind of rough. But I could see this potentially coming up if you just equip it to a big guy and then your opponent's like, man, I can't get over that thing. What will I do? Maybe there's something there, but I think overall this card is not really worth playing, just like most equips are not worth playing. Next up, we've got Radiant Mirror Force with a normal trap that says when an opponent's monster declares an attack while they control 3 or more attack position monsters, destroy all attack position monsters your opponent controls. So this can be good. You might be wondering why I'm putting that under Lucky Iron Axe, whereas Lucky Iron Axe is equip spell that are generally not good. And this seems like it's Pseudo Mirror Force, so that seems a lot better. But I do think the reason why this card should not see play is because your opponent generally won't summon 3 or more attack position monsters and attack in, because Mirror Force is in the format already. Also, Torrential Tribute's in the format. There are a lot of things that can punish overcommitting to a board. And so your opponent likely will be avoiding this card anyways, just by avoiding better cards. So this card's just too situational. I don't really think it will ever see play. Next up, we've got Triggered Summon, the normal trap that says activate only when a monster is special summoned to your opponent's side of the field. Each player can special summon 1 level 4 lower monster from your hand. So that's kind of neat. It's kind of like 2-man Cell Battle earlier, and it's got 2 iconic monsters, Celtic Guardian and Battleox, on the art for it. So that's very cool. But I feel like if your opponent's special summoning a monster to their side of the field, they're in the sort of position of power, whereas you're in position of weakness. And doing this to allow your opponent to extend further and also potentially put you have a defense vision monster or something, but just provide that sort of measly defense there is not really as good as just playing a better card to defend yourself, right? So I don't really think this is that good. I guess you play this with Lava Golem. If you special summon Lava Golem to your opponent's side of the field, then you activate this to special summon a level 4 monster from your hand. That's kind of neat. But I think unless you're doing that specific sort of thing, this card is not really that good. And even in decks that do that specific sort of thing, this card is not really that good. So I would not personally play this thing. And I think it's probably the worst card in this set outside of, some archetypal theming that might be a little bit worse. But that's going to do it for the set breakdown here. I hope that you enjoyed me going through all the new cards in Trooper format. I'll show off some deck lists before we actually end the video, just so you get an idea of what people are playing in the modern version of the event. But I do think that, over time, as we dig deeper into this format, we might discover even new stuff. And I'm really excited to dive into the current archetypes that I talked about in this video and sort of put my own spin on Trooper format. So look forward to that. So first up, we've got a machine build by Splevin here that won the last event, which was a single-day event. This is called Machine Beat, but it also does play the Rises. So, Perfect Circle Monarch vibes are going on here, even if you're also playing these machines and limit removal and machine duplication to pair with the Card Trooper, because this format is called Troop Dupe Scoop for a reason, You bring out Card Trooper, you duplicate it, and then that's a lot of damage coming at your opponent, so they just scoop it up. So, this is a pretty good list if you want to start out with. It's got Siren Phoenixes and Decoys to draw deeper. It's got the Spies to fuel Monarch plays, get Jinja to shut off your opponent's defenses. So this is a very, very good list, and I will be featuring a list like this, if not this list exactly, on the channel, and testing it out to see if it can still compete against some of the other decks running around in Trooper format. Of course, since Ryza is around, you do have just Perfect Circle Monarch, which is, very familiar to people who played Perfect Circle. But this deck is very powerful. I mean, Malicious is still 3 copies, so you can do stuff with that. But use Stratos to search out like Disc Commander to get an engrave for like Crush Card Virus potentially, Pre-Mat, Call the Haunted to bring it back. You're using things like Ryza and also the Phoenix Wings to stack your opponent's deck, so that way they can't draw outstanding this, and you're just getting in and you're killing them. So this is a very, very powerful deck. Very powerful in Perfect Circle, still powerful here. And I'll also be experimenting with this to see how it does against some of the other Trooper decks that are running around. But these are the 2 decks that people have sort of settled on for the like meta at the time. Basically Machine Beat and this sort of Ryza Perfect Circle Monarch deck. I think both are pretty good. I'll be testing them out for myself to see which one I prefer. And I'll also be testing out a variety of other decks to see if anything can compete against these decks. But I look forward to going through that journey with y'all. If you want to see me go through those sorts of decks and show off those cards, then subscribe to the channel. I'll release more gameplay content in the future, and I'll also be releasing more sort of format guides. Like, these aren't really guides because I just sort of go through the new cards and cover some deck lists, but I'll be doing more of those in the future, and the next one should be zombie format, I believe, although I could be wrong about that, but that'll be a while. That'll probably be after I do all my Trooper coverage here. But like, comment, subscribe to help grow the channel even further, help expand the reach of these formats, and, help get more people playing. If you want to play any of these formats for yourself, head on over to the YGO from Zero Discord server, linked in the description down below. Also, as always, big shout outs to my patrons, Rinswin, Porkchop Kun, Bren Donker, Tyler Compton, GeoMyFest, Dump Truck, and Scout Zero. It means a lot that y'all support me, encouraging me to make more videos like this in the future. I hope you enjoy as always, and until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.